All right, so the first plant we're going to look at is these, which I'm just referring to as spider plants, but not sure exactly what they would be called in nature, but you see these a lot. And this is something that if I look at the scene, we can see I've got 4 of them, which are all generated from the same stroke. I just randomize the seed value when I make copies or maybe make a couple changes to attributes. I can see in here which preset I started with, so stroke palm leafy. And then made a bunch of changes to get this to look the way that I needed it to. And then obviously as far as the shader goes, if we go in here, we can see that this is a very simple shading network that I created for this plant. So for plants that are larger or more hero and close to camera, that's when I'm going to want to maybe create, a front color and back color and bump map and spec map and really get detailed with it. But sometimes you can be really simple, and this is an example of that. And we can also see that I used the DJX script to tile the UVs of my plants, or the plant leaves, into a 3x3 tile. And we can see a texture that I created for that. And so I actually just went outside, grabbed some, I have some plants that are similar to this in my backyard. So I just grabbed some leaves and scanned them and made this 3x3 texture. So really, really simple. And so if we want to go in here and let's hide these. And let me get my stroke visible. So there's the paint effect stroke. And so with this, we can see we have some branching, some twigs that are in there as well. And then these very long leaves that are coming out and obviously have a little bit of bend or gravity that's affecting them. So what this started from was the stroke palm leafy. And so let's go and take that stroke. Or let's first take this guy and let's move him to the side. And then let's go and create Invisor. Oops. Let me go into plants, mesh, and in here, let me just make it a little bit bigger. Click on it again so it resizes, and we can see that I've got palm leafy, and there's also this rubber plant, which is also a good starting point for certain kind of plants. But you can see that if I look at the palm leafy, it kind of has a similar good start point for this kind of plant. So if I select it and paint one in here, I'm just going to paint one at the origin. It pops in really tiny. And so I'm going to need to scale that up. And so first thing I'm going to do is go to the attribute editor, palm leafy, and I'm just going to increase the global scale. So just so this is more at the scale I want to work at. All right, so this is this preset. So to get this guy to look more like this is really relatively straightforward. It's just a matter of changing the shape of the leaves and changing the angle at which the branching occurs from. So if we wanted to make those changes, I'm going to go and turn off my resolution gate. And let's go to the attribute editor for this stroke and take a look. So first we want to see with this stroke that it's set to brush type mesh, and under mesh it's set to 8 sections, which is a little heavy, so I'm going to lower it down to 4. So each of the tubes inside there only has 4 sections. And 4. So that's the first thing I'll do. And then I want to understand how this preset is built. So I'm going to go under tubes, and I'm going to go under growth and creation. Under growth we can see there's twigs, but there's no branches, and there are leaves. Under creation we can see obviously settings for the length, minimum and maximum, that it's got 16 segments going along the tube, and that's kind of the most important things for right now. Then going down here, we can see that under the width scale area, that there's a little bit of scaling on the width of the tube. And then under tube direction, you can see it has elevation min and max. So elevation, remember, is just the elevation of that plant. So if the elevation is anything other than 1 and 1, it's going to lean to the side. And the direction it leans to is based on the azimuth min and max. And so by having a min -1 and max 1, it just means that if there were multiple palm leafy plants along a long curve, they could all angle in a different direction. But if you only have one of them, it's just going to bias into a single direction. So when I have something like a spider plant like this, where I want them to be able to bend in all directions, often I'll put the min and max to 1, so it's going straight up and down. And then I can use gravity to bend them in all directions. So that's the first change I'm going to make. So if I then, before we look at the twigs and the leaves, I'm going to jump down to behavior, because I just mentioned gravity. And under forces, we'll see is where gravity is. So if I modify the gravity, you can see I can start to get all those branches or twigs to bend down. So that's just something to point out. So you can see that they're kind of going in all directions. So let's lower that back down. Okay. So then when I look at this, a very obvious thing I know that I'm going to probably want to change if I'm trying to make a spider plant is these leaves are too wide. So I'm going to go under the leaves. I might make a change to that first. So I'm not concerned right now about the number of leaves. I just want to change their width. So under leaves, we'll see leaf length, base width, and tip width. And it's important to understand that these two, the base width and tip width, work in conjunction with the leaf width scale. So the width of these leaves, you can see how they start narrow, and then it gets wider, and then it gets thinner, and then suddenly gets really thin at the tip. That's all this stuff in here. And so I'm not so concerned with that. So I can just go and delete a bunch of these little markers in here. And you can see, and then let's delete another one, the effect that the width scale has, which is super, super useful. So when you're doing a leaf that you're going to map a texture to, like a leaf on the bush that we made, we might want all the leaves just to be perfectly square. And that way the texture we apply with its alpha channel, or cutout opacity, creates the shape of the leaf. But for something like the spider plant, it's kind of a lot easier to just have the geometry of the leaf be the exact shape it needs to be. And then that way, I don't even need a cutout opacity map. And so again, if we look at the shader that we had, which is this guy, there's no alpha channel. So you can see it's getting gamma corrected, going into diffuse. It's also going into the translucency color. But I am not, with this plant, using an alpha channel. And here, this is going into translucency. I actually should have gamma corrected that. So I just didn't put that in. So going back here, I can adjust the shape of these leaves, so you can see I can make them nice and thin, like what I'm going for with the spider plant. And then at the tip, I want them to go down to a point. So already what we have here is a very different looking type of plant, which you might find useful. And you can see we're getting close to what we want. It's just these branches and stems are a little long. So you can adjust the base width and the tip width, but as you can see, they do work in conjunction with the leaf width scale. So now the length of the leaves, which is this guy, is obviously kind of already close to what I want. So I'm going to kind of not really adjust that too much. So what else is going on with these leaves? Well, if I go down and look at underneath leaf width scale, you'll see that leaf start is at a very high number. That's where along the branch or twig the leaves begin to grow. And you'll see it's at 1, basically. So a leaf begins growing right at the end of the twig or branch. So if I lower it down, you'll see that these leaves are going to start to grow at a lower point along the branch. So for this kind of plant and lots of other ones, you want just one leaf at the end of each twig. So I would choose to put leaf twigs or leaf start all the way up to 1. Now the angle we'll see is at 0 on both of these, which is what I want. By having the angle at 0, it's going to just continue along the direction that that twig is bending. If I adjust the angle, you can see that I can get it to emit off of that branch, let's say at a 90-degree angle. So we have 2 angle sliders in here, but since we only have leaves at the end of the twig, that's not really doing anything. If we had a bunch of leaves that were emitting along the entire twig, then angle 1 and angle 2 would refer to the angle at the end of the twig and the angle of the leaves at the beginning of the twig. But we don't need that for this plant. So I want to leave that at 0 and 0. So you'll see that we have leaf twist, which isn't really working right now. That just depends on other attributes that are currently overriding it. Leaf forward twist, which we don't need. You can see it's just going to angle the leaf. And then leaf bend is in here a little bit. So if I put leaf bend to 0, they still have a little bend because gravity is also pulling them down. So sometimes you'll use leaf bend in conjunction with gravity. So I'll leave a little bit of that in there. So also important, we have leaf curl. Now let me just go and get rid of a bunch of these. So I definitely want leaf curl in here. And if you put leaf curl to a value of 0.5, you'll get none, which means each one of these leaves are going to be perfectly flat. It has a bend, but you can see it's flat along here. The moment I put something, a value other than 0.5, it inserts an extra division down the center. And you can see I can go and bend this leaf. So what I want is to bend it that way, so that where it emits at the end of the branch, it's bent that way. And then in lots of plants, over the course or the length of the leaf, it flattens out. So you can see I can have a little bit of this curl at the beginning, but not as much at the end. Then down here, we'll see an attribute which we've mentioned, which is critically important for this kind of plant, which is not activated right now, which is leaf face sun. I need to put that to 1 to make sure that my leaves are biasing to face the sky. So we can see the effect of it. But for this, just so we can see on this example here, all of these leaves are biasing to face the sky. So that's what I need in here. And then now I can go and mess with the curl a little bit. And that looks all right. Leaf flatness has to be at 1. I don't want these leaves to have any thickness, so that needs to be at 1. If you lower that, they're going to get thick. So if you're doing like a succulent plant, that would be useful. But for this, not necessary. Leaf size decay is not activated right now because we only have 1 leaf at the end. If the leaves were emitting along the entire branch, then that would control the decay of the size of the leaves along the branch. Stiffness, how much are the leaves affected by forces such as gravity? So if I put it to 1 and I put the bend to 0, they'll be perfectly straight. So as I lower stiffness, they get more and more affected by any forces that are on down in your forces folder. So obviously stiffness is really important. Okay. Translucency, specular color, we don't care about any of that because we're going to be making our own shader. And that's pretty much the leaf settings. So really, what we need to do is figure out how to shorten these branches. So let's now move on from the leaves. And we'll look at branches and twigs. Now we can see that twigs is on, branches is off. If I turn on branches, you can see we get something different. And immediately I can see when I turn branches on, it's like, it actually already looks maybe a little bit closer to what I want. So down here with branches and twigs, we have this attribute called branch after twigs, which is off right now. If I turn it on, we can see we get a different look, which we may like, but for what I'm doing, I don't need it. So what at this point do I need to change to adjust things? Well, since I have twigs, now I can turn off the twigs and just have branches if I want. And so if I have just branches, I can say number of branches 10, right? And now I'm going to get something like this, but it's going to look very, very uniform. And so to break it up a little bit, that's why I like to have the twigs in there as well. But as far as the length, you'll see there's nothing in here for branches that has to do with the length of the branches. And the reason is because the length of the branches is actually related to the length of the start tube, which is all the way up here under creation. So if you adjust the length here, it'll adjust the length of these branches, as you can see. So I can make them taller or shorter. So I want, if I look inside here and I turn off the twigs, I can see my branches are already relatively short. So I don't necessarily need them much shorter. I can go in here under length max and length min, and you can see make them taller, make them shorter, but that's kind of all right. So it's really when I turn the twigs on that I can see my twigs are too long. So I'm going to go down to the twigs, and twigs do have length. So I can shorten these twigs down a little bit so they're just a little bit shorter. And now you can see I'm getting pretty close to what we have over here. So I just might want to go in and say like, well, for my twigs, I can adjust the angle that the twigs emit off the branches. So they can come off the branches at a 90-degree angle or be very, very close. So I want a little bit of angle there. And so we have angle 1 and 2, so it's going to be angle towards the bottom of the branch versus angle towards the top of the branch. Twig twist, how they get emitted. You can see if you put twist to 0, all of the twigs are emitting off the same side of the branch. So I need to have twig twist be at least negative 0.5 or positive 0.5 to randomize that. And then importantly, we have twig stiffness, which is how the twig is affected by gravity or any other forces. So at this point, I don't necessarily need it to have that much. Twigs start, where along the branch do the twigs begin? Right at the end, just like with leaves, or mix it up a little bit. And then there you go. I'm pretty close to creating, what I want for a generic spider plant. So I might want to go to my leaves now that I've adjusted the twigs and the branches. Open that up. And then I could go and say, well, maybe I want to make adjustment to gravity, so maybe they get pulled down a little bit more. And then we can see they're intersecting the ground. So there's a force we can use for that, which is deflection, which I've mentioned. So I go to forces, and I'll turn on deflection. And then you can see I can use the max value to determine how far up the deflection goes. And that's pretty much fine. So sometimes I might get one leaf that's going through the ground. I don't care about that because you'll never notice. Like in that forest scene that we saw, you didn't notice that like this plant has maybe a leaf going through the ground. If it's a hero plant, then, I might take more time on it, or after I convert to poly, actually just edit the polys manually. So what else is important to point out in here? Something that I didn't adjust, but is important for something like this spider plant, is the segments were already at a very high number for the leaves, based on the palm leafy preset. So for a leaf like this that needs to have a lot of curl or bend to it with gravity, you're obviously going to need a lot of segments. And so that would be one of the first things, like I've mentioned before, to modify. So if you think you're going to need a lot of segments or a lot of bend in a leaf or a branch, make sure before you start editing all of the parameters for the behavior and look of it, that you get your segments set first. Because when you change the segments after the fact, it really changes the look of your leaf or branch or twig. So you can see that if I go up to 12 or 20 versus 16, I get different looks. So if I decide, oh, this actually needs 20 segments, now you can see I'm going to have to go and make some changes maybe to the stiffness to get the same look. So the number of segments you put really is how close to camera this is going to be. So if this thing is going to be super close to camera, you don't want to see a bunch of straight faceted lines, so you'll need more segments. I knew that in my forest scene, the little path, that these were not going to be super close to camera, so that's where something like 16 is okay. So if we look at the preset I made, you can see I actually did lower the segments down to 10 just because I knew they were going to be a little further away. So if I go in here and say, all right, well, maybe we use 12, then I need to now lower the stiffness down to get back to a similar look. And then I can go down here and say like, well, maybe I want a little more gravity on the branches. And then obviously if I add more gravity, it's affecting not just the leaves, it's affecting the leaves and the branches and the twigs. So it's a big balancing act. So I can go and be like, all right, well, I want a little bit more gravity in here. And then now if I go to my leaves, maybe I'll play with the leaf stiffness. And there you go. We've pretty much replicated an almost identical plant to what we have here on the left. So while I've been doing this, I have not been concerned at all with the number of branches or leaves or twigs, because once you start raising that up, things will get a little slower. And it's very easy to change that. Just remember the number of leaves is based on leaves in cluster and number of leaves cluster. And so now leaves in cluster means that how many leaves grow together at the same point on a branch. And so here it's set to 1. Number of leaf clusters, 1. That's appropriate in this case because I only want 1 leaf at the end of each twig. If I go up to the twigs, we can see we have twigs in cluster. How many twigs will grow on the branch at the same point? So if I put that to 2, we now get 2 twigs at each branch point. And obviously by doing that, it's going to increase the number of leaves we have. So to increase the density on this guy, I can either increase twigs in cluster or increase the number of twig clusters along the branch. So I have 9, put that to 20. So if I look at this and start feeling, well, I'm getting too many leaves in bundles because of how they're coming off these branches, then it might mean I actually just need more branches than more twigs. So along each branch, maybe I'm happy having just, 6 twig clusters, but I want more branches, so I'll go up to branches and increase the number of branches. So I can say, well, let's say every time it splits into 3. Well, let's say it splits into 4. And now I'm getting a little bit more even dispersion along this plant. And so I can put that to 5, and now it gets a little bit more dense. So cool. So that's pretty much how to make a spider plant. And so if we look at our scene again, let's go back to Photoshop. So when I look in here, this guy right there is pretty much what we've just created. So what I also have in here is, let's say, that's a little different, is that guy right there, or that guy right there. It starts from the spider plant. I just made the leaves a little bit wider. So if we go back into Maya, I can be like, all right, well, I like my spider plant preset. So, and let's go and turn off that one. So here's the one we made. And then I might be like, all right, but I want to make a variation on this, which might have a different shader. And so I would go in and say, all right, well, happy with this plant. So I will duplicate my brush. So duplicate special, reset, duplicate the graph. And then I'll hide that one. Here's my copy. And then now I can make some changes to this guy. So for this plant, I'm like, well, maybe I definitely don't want so many branches. And I want my leaves to be wider. So I'm going to go to the leaves, and I could just go and make them wider this way. And maybe I want them to be a little bit wider at the base than at the tip. So I can see it's getting a little bit of a straight line at the base there. So for this one, maybe I want more segments on it. And just a matter of going in and messing around to get a nice curvature that I'm happy with. And maybe I actually want them even wider. I could choose and say maybe that they stay wider along the length of the branch. And then I don't want these to be so stiff, or rather so opposite of that, meaning I want them to be stiffer, so they're shooting a little bit more straight up. And then I want a little bit more curl on them, so I'm going to go and put a little bit more curl on these branches. Definitely leaf face up. Now one thing I should point out, notice that when I adjust my curl, that some of my leaves, and I'm going to lower the number of branches I have down in here, or let's lower the number of twig clusters down. Okay, that when I adjust curl, that it's making some of the leaves bend up, and some of the leaves are bending down, which you might find frustrating. Well, the weird thing is when you convert this to polys, they'll all be unified. So let me point that out. So if I modify, convert, paint effects to polygons, and hit reset, I want quad output, poly limit 0, so there's no limit, and don't hide the stroke, convert. You'll see that in the converted group, they're all unified. So you can see they're all pointing down as far as the curl goes. So what that really means, if I go to this guy, is I want my curl to actually be this way. So I'm looking at the leaves that are curling up right there. So I can adjust that, and then they maybe flatten out a little bit at the end. And now if I modify, convert, paint effects to polygons, and move this guy, you'll see they're all curling in the correct direction. So it's just a weird quirk to be aware of when you're using curling, where what you see with paint effects will actually be less accurate than what you see when you convert it to polys. So just good to know. So now inside here, that's pretty much what I wanted here. Maybe I want to introduce a little bit of bend. Maybe I want to, on my twigs, maybe mess with the stiffness a little bit on them. I can also adjust the angle on the twigs. And then let's see, go inside here on my branches. I can play with the split twist on the branches. So if I didn't like how things were looking, I can just go and sort of mess around with split twist to rotate things around. Get it to look a little bit more like what I want. And then going in here to my leaves, mess around with stiffness a little bit more. What you can also do, which is cool, is you can see that I can do stuff like this, where I can have them bending down with gravity, but then bending up at the tips. So again, something more common with succulents, because they're thicker and they can do stuff like that. They have a lot more ability to hold their shape than a leaf. That's going to be a lot more influenced by gravity. And then in here, as far as my twigs, I still want to play with the twig angle. And then as far as the branching goes, I also have my split angle on the branches. So you can see that I can choose that, but I want this thing to be a little bit more vertical of a plant. Okay, so that looks good. And so now I've pretty much created something that's much more similar to the other plant that I had. So if we take a look at this guy, display, show selection, and let's scoot this guy to the side. So starting with the palm leafy preset, creating this kind of spider plant versus creating this plant which has wider leaves that are just a little bit more vertical. So adjusting the branch angle and a few settings on the leaves. And so now going inside here, obviously we do sometimes end up where we have branches that are intersecting each other. Not a lot you can do about that other than playing around with things like your split twist to try and modify that a little bit. So you can see now I was able to get it so that I don't really see it intersecting in that spot. There's going to always be some. Can't really get it, but you won't notice it in a render. So unless it's a hero plant and it's up close, and then you just grab those polys after you convert it to a poly and scoot it. So two different kinds of plants. I'm happy with the density on this one. I don't think it needs any more leaves. So these are now very similar to what I created in here. So as you can see, that plant as opposed to our little tiny spider plants. So back in Maya. So the next thing obviously would be to convert these to polys and make some variations. So if I was happy with this one, then I would say modify convert, although I would choose to move this back to the origin first. And then say, okay, well for this guy, modify convert paint effects to polygons. I don't want to hide the stroke. Grab that copy, move it out of the way. Grab my stroke. Let's grab that other stroke and hide it. And then I want to make some variations on this. So I would go up to here and mess with the seed value. So that's kind of a cool looking variation on that plant. So if I like that one, modify, convert, paint effects to polygons, scoot that out of the way, and then just keep playing with the seed value. And then as I play with the seed value, sometimes I'll get something that I like, but there's one thing about it that I'm not that crazy about. So maybe I decide, well, for some of these copies that I make, maybe I want the density or the number of leaves to be different. So like I like this one, but maybe I'll go down to number of start branches and change that to 4. And then like, all right, I like that one. Modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. Grab that group. I have 3 of them. Go to this one. Go back to the seed value. And just look around for one that I like. So like here, maybe I want to have one that's just biased into one direction. Or I could say like, well, this one I think I like as like a younger one. It doesn't have as many leaves. And so maybe I'll modify, convert paint effects to polygons on this one, but actually scale it down a little bit. So it's kind of like a younger version of one of these plants. And then there you go. So now, hide that. You can see we've built a quick little library of these little spider plants. And then I can go to this other stroke that I have for this other plant. And if I'm happy with this one, which I look at it, I'm like, you know, I think that it probably could use a little bit of tweaking. But it's just a matter of looking around, saying, okay, well, mess around with the angle of the twigs a little bit. Mess around maybe with the amount of curl on these leaves. Maybe I'm going to give it a lot more curl. You can even have it curl in the opposite direction at the end. So it curls in one direction at the beginning, as we can see here, and then curls the other way at the end of the branch. But I don't really want that for this guy. I could choose to introduce a little noise into this one. So we're only using gravity right now. So you have an attribute called random. So introducing that, you can see is going to randomize things. Just be aware that it randomizes not just the twigs and branches, but also the leaves. So you have to use this carefully. So maybe just a little bit of random. And then if I go under turbulence, turbulence is off, but I could choose to add a little bit of turbulence. You can experiment with all of these, but usually grass or wind is what I'm going to use. These can be used for animation, but that's something we get into much later. But I'm just going to go in here and, you know, I can add a little bit of turbulence and adjust the frequency of the turbulence and mess with the speed value just to see different variations on those turbulence settings. So now it's added a little bit of sort of randomness. So you can see that this leaf, instead of being totally straight, is bending to the side a little bit. So that looks kind of cool. So again, I added a little bit of turbulence, messed with the random value, and now maybe I like this guy, so I'll select it, modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. Grab that guy, move it to the side, and then go and play with the seed value. There's another one that looks kind of cool. I do have a intersection there that maybe I don't like. But I could also just go in and just delete one of those leaves after the fact. So meaning if I like this one, modify, convert, paint effects to polygons, I can grab it, scoot it over here, and just decide, okay, well, that leaf is intersecting there. So it doesn't really bother me that much, to be honest, but if it does bother you, to grab a leaf, since it's all combined, I'll just select a face and then shift angle bracket to grab all the polys for that object. And then you can see that I can choose to move this guy a little bit so that I don't have that intersection. Obviously, you could be anal about it to make sure the start point of the leaf is on the branch and whatever. So now that's a little bit better. And now I have that guy. Scoot that over there. So just creating a bunch of different plants. And then finally, let's just do one more. So I'm just looking around. So that one's actually cool. So this leaf is going through the ground a little bit there, but I don't care about that, like I've said. So modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. And every time I convert, I have construction history off right now, this little button. So all of these are now independent meshes. So I'm going to hide my paint effect stroke. And then on this guy, you know, if I want to do something about those verts that are going through the ground, it's no big deal. I can always just go and do something about it. So that's resolved. Okay, so now we have made a bunch of plants. So you've hopefully understand the basics of making something like a spider plant, and it should be pretty clear just with the kind of things that I'm doing. As long as you have a nice start point, it's pretty easy. So the next thing I would do for these is for each one of them, I would choose to randomize the UVs, meaning that I'm going to go and select these, and I can just hit my button. And so again, what that button does, it's a Python script. I'm using the DJX UV script. Let's say I put them into 3 by 3, and then I can just execute that. Or I can also just go in here and select a leaf and hit the button. And if I now select that and go to the UV texture editor, I can see that it's in 3 by 3. Right now it just has the default texture that PaintFX gave to it. So I would select these and adjust the UVs on the leaf for each one. And then now they just need a shader. So in here I've got this very simple MIA material which just has a gamma correct node with the values just set to a color that's green. These are just for the branches because you don't really see them. They're going to be so small. So those just get that really simple shader. And then all the leaves, I already have this shader in here, so I'll just grab all the leaves and I can assign that to it. And then delete unused, it'll delete all the ugly PaintFX shaders. View resolution gate. And let me save our scene. So this is our toot spider. And then we can render that out. So cool. So we have these, and so for the ones that have the thin leaves, I might like that texture, while for the ones that have the thicker leaves, I have other textures that I can use. So if I go in here to this file texture, I'm going to go to, let's say, my leaf scans, grass. So you can see these simple grass leaves that I have. And I have this custom one that I made where, and I'm going to wait for this helicopter to go by, so I'm just going to pause for a second. All right. And I just took, as you can see, this leaf texture and then just a plain leaf texture like this one and just put this one on top of this one. So I have like a dark center. Let me make it bigger. And so this is common with a lot of these types of plants where you have maybe a dark center or a lighter center. So let's grab that. Now that one's not a 3 by 3. So when I'm in a situation that I'm already adjusted the UVs into 3 by 3, but I want to use a texture that isn't, I can just go to the placement node and just put it to 3 by 3. So it repeats that same texture 3 times in U and V. So it'll work with the leaves with the adjusted UVs. And the cool thing is I could go in here on this file texture and choose to multiply the color gain with, let's say, a fractal or a ramp or noise or whatever, so that each little quadrant gets a different color using a base single texture. But if we want to go in and take a look at that different texture being applied to the leaves, you can see how they're getting this darker center going down the middle of each one. But they still have a little bit of a dead tip. So if I decide, okay, well, for some of them I want that, but the other ones I want the other texture I had, I'll take this shader, I'll duplicate the shading network, and then inside here, for these guys, that one, that one, that one, and that one, I'm going to assign this copy, and on the copy, I'll just put this 3 by 3 and set the placement node on this one not to repeat. And then render that out. And so we can see we're just getting some variation. So these ones with the broader leaves have that dark stripe down the middle, and the ones with the thinner leaves don't, but they do have 9 different textures that are being randomly placed on those different leaves. Okay, so that's it for making these plants. So we're going to now move on to some of the other plants that I made for the forest scene.